bill be now read a second time. I offer the call to the member for Perth.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. This is a very interesting piece of legislation, and I just want to affirm that I support the concepts of genetic modification of plant life. We have, in fact, over our course of our civilisation, have been very actively engaged in the breeding of plants, and indeed to a very large extent it's that work that has driven civilisation and the whole notion of the production of surplus and the freeing up that does to labour to create many other things. Some negative, but many obviously positive. So I certainly don't want to put myself in the anti-GM camp, but I do want to nevertheless say that I wouldn't be wholeheartedly embracing this legislation at this point, because it does, in my view, contain some potential to reduce the amount of information and understanding that we have about genetically modified crops. And I think it is incredibly important, if we are going to get support for genetically modified crops, that we need to ensure that there is a very transparent process, and that these are the use of genetically modified crops is able to be properly tracked and analysed. I mean, I think there is enormous potential to increase the nutritional value of food through genetic modification. I'm also particularly interested in the work that has been done in taking the genes from plants in Africa, in very arid areas in Africa, and marrying those with our crops to ensure that as our climate dries, particularly in southern Australia and southwest of Western Australia, this of course could be a very positive modification. But I must say I am disappointed that much of that work seems to be tied up with from the research that I can see, seems to be tied up with the herbicide-resistant and the insect-resistant genetic modification. And these are some of the areas, I think it's those areas that have created concerns. Now, some of the concerns are, in fact, legal in nature, and I'm not confident that we really have got our legal instruments right here, our legal institutional framework right here around the GM licensing, and the impact that that the spread of GM into non-GM areas can have, and the rather bizarre and perverse consequences that can occur to a non-GM farmer who not only has then a limited ability to market their ability to market their goods as GM-free is compromised, but they also might find themselves inadvertently on the receiving end of an action by the GM seed grower that they have utilised improperly and without a licence utilised that seed, even though it is quite unwitting and indeed something that they would not want to have happen. So I still think that we do have a major problem around this area. Now, there has also been, I've been to some presentations regarding some of the alleged biological problems that might emerge from using particularly some of the insect-resistant GM, and the impact that this might have on our biology and the biology of the plants. Now, I'm not in a position to judge whether or not that these particular scientists putting these views out are totally legitimate. I've certainly had some very vigorous correspondence from both sides of the story from people in my electorate, and it may well be that scientists such as the Emeritus Professor Don Huber from Purdue University, perhaps his science is not as rigorous as one might like. But nevertheless, I do think that we have to keep an open mind here. And I was just very mindful of a piece of research I read in the last week about the impact that lots of our current plant breeding has had on the nutritional value of crops, that we have in our quest to make fruit and vegetables less bitter, more sweet, that because we haven't fully understood the biological mechanism and the chemical actions that is precipitated by eating these fruit and vegetable, and indeed what we are doing inadvertently has resulted in a very significant drop in the nutritional values of those foods. So we have been breeding in order to counter, to make these goods superficially more desirable, but in that process inadvertently compromised the nutritional value of those foods. So whilst there is people are very quick to jump on the work of Professor Huber, I do caution that we must, in this area, be constantly prepared to research these matters and to keep a watching eye on what the implications of these genetic modifications that we are making. And I do think it is very important for us to ensure that the science is not compromised by the power of the seed companies. And as I said, I find it somewhat disappointing from what I can see that the vast majority of the genetic modification that is going on is very much led by companies like Monsanto, who are also the sellers of the herbicides and that are being made more usable by this these genetic modifications. So I think my plea would be that we accept that genetic modification can be a very positive way of us improving the crops that we have available to us, particularly at a time of a rapidly changing climate, and given the rapid increase in populations. So as we got the amount of available agricultural areas contracting, the population's growing, quite clearly we have to do something better and smarter. But I would be very concerned if we were too readily scaling back the keeping track of what it was we're doing and making sure that we do fund independent and truly independent research into the impact of these genetically modified products and what impact they may in fact be having on whether it is our gut flora or the nutritional value of those crops. And of course, finally, ensure that we have a fair legal framework in place so that those that farmers that do not want to be GM farmers are not finding themselves inadvertently caught up in the legal process. And of course, I think it's important at this stage in our community that we do ensure that there is some reasonable labelling of GM food, because there are people out there who believe that this is important, just as there's people out there that believe it's important that halal be notified on their product. There are people for whom, consumers for whom, the GM is equally important, and I think it's good business practice for us to ensure that that market is provided for. Thanks very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker.